Hey guys, tonight we begin with a journey into the shadowy and somewhat unsettling world of the dead and the rituals humans have devised to deal with them. Settle and dim the lights and let your mind drift a little while we explore what the ancients thought was the proper way to send someone off for good. You may want a blanket or a cup of tea because some of these customs are oddly calming in their meticulousness, but also creepily meticulous in their own way. We start with the Vikings, who believed death was merely a doorway to another party in the afterlife. The most famous example is the ship burial, where a noble would be laid to rest on a wooden vessel surrounded by weapons and treasures. Sometimes the deceased was even given a living companion to ensure they did not feel lonely in the next world, because nothing says eternal friendship like mandatory post-mortem company. Archaeologists have found skeletons where it seems the companions were gently placed rather than violently offered. This suggests a slow, somber farewell rather than a dramatic exit. Imagine lying in a wooden boat with the wind softly rustling through the sails above your head, while your favorite possessions are arranged around you like an eerie museum exhibit. Some Vikings even set the boat on fire, hoping to light the way to Valhalla, but often the flames were more symbolic than practical because smoke and water tend to interfere with one another. Explorers who uncovered these burial ships centuries later noted a quiet awe in the air. Some reported strange sensations of being watched, though that may have been nothing more than imagination fueled by shadows and the smell of old pine. Let us float over to the deserts of Egypt, where mummification became a precise art form that would make a surgeon weep with envy and a mortician sigh with relief. The Egyptians believed preserving the body was essential to maintaining the soul's journey after death. Some pharaohs demanded that every organ be meticulously embalmed and placed in a jar with labels that read like an inventory list. Priests performed rituals over days, ensuring the deceased would not rise prematurely or wander aimlessly. Yet the tombs often went wrong, either due to natural decay or ambitious tomb robbers. Some mummies were found with missing limbs or holes in their skulls, suggesting that perhaps even in death chaos could intrude. The creepy element is not just the physical preservation, but the curses inscribed on the tombs warning trespassers of doom. Many early archaeologists scoffed at these inscriptions, until they found themselves falling ill or encountering unexplained misfortunes. Some of these curses are mild, like a broken tool or a lost horse, but others ended tragically. The infamous case of the explorer who opened a newly discovered tomb only to become delirious and perish in the desert remains a classic tale. Scholars debate whether it was disease or just the coincidence of poor timing. But the legend persists because humans love the idea that the dead have agency even after being wrapped in linen for millennia. Meanwhile, in remote corners of Asia, certain civilizations practiced ritual burials so strange that one might wonder if they were designed for the living as much as the dead. Some tribes would leave the body exposed on a platform high in the mountains for birds to consume. This was not negligence, but a form of respect, believing the soul needed to be carried to the heavens by winged messengers. Explorers climbing those peaks centuries later often reported an eerie stillness broken by the occasional flutter of feathers. Some claimed that the spirits of the departed could be felt hovering like a gentle wind around their necks. There is a quiet poetry in the ritual, yet an undeniable chill. The Americas had their own unsettling traditions. Certain cultures in South America practiced burial in caves or deep pits where the dead were surrounded by ceramics and textiles meant to accompany them forever. Some elite members were even placed in tight enclosures to simulate a womb, ensuring rebirth into the afterlife. Archaeologists discovered these burials and marveled at the ingenuity and dedication, but also at the claustrophobic nature of the spaces. It is fascinating to imagine someone spending their eternal rest, curled like a child in a dark cavern with precious items pressed against their chest. There are cases where explorers unwittingly disturbed these graves and reported strange phenomena. Some swore that footprints appeared in sand where none should exist. Others heard whispers or caught shadows moving in the corner of their vision. Of course, skeptics attribute these sensations to fatigue or imagination, but the persistence of such stories is uncanny. It suggests that humans have always suspected that the dead might watch, remember, and even influence the living. As we drift further, we find ourselves in the forests of northern Europe, where some forgotten civilizations buried their dead in bogs. The preservation was so complete that even skin and hair survived for centuries. Archaeologists who studied these bodies were struck by the meticulous placement of hands and heads, as if the dead were posing for an eternal portrait. Some of these bog bodies show signs of ritual sacrifice, but the exact reason remains unclear. It could have been an offering to gods, or an attempt to appease spirits. Whatever the intention, the result is unsettling because the dead look shockingly alive. Even in Africa, there were practices where corpses were carefully positioned in hidden chambers beneath the ground. Items were buried alongside them, not only as offerings, but as tools to guide them into the next world. Explorers noted a pervasive sense of order in these tombs, as if the builders wanted to maintain control over life even in the shadow of death. Sometimes these chambers were booby-trapped or sealed with complex locks, ensuring that the deceased remained undisturbed. The consequences of breaking these seals were rumored to be dire, and some stories suggest strange illnesses or sudden deaths befell those who dared. And so, as we close our first evening with the shadows of ship burials, mummified pharaohs, and sacrificial pits, we are reminded that humans have always sought control over death, while simultaneously fearing its unpredictability. Explorers who touched these ancient practices often returned with tales that blur the line between reality and myth. One account in particular stands out: a young archaeologist who uncovered a burial chamber only to feel a chilling presence that would not leave him even after he returned home. Right after that chilling presence, the young archaeologist returned home feeling a weight on his chest that seemed to follow him into every room. At first, he told himself it was exhaustion from travel, or perhaps the imagination running wild from too many candlelit nights among ancient bones. He could not deny, though, that shadows seemed to linger longer than they should and that whispers floated through his apartment when no one else was near. He tried to continue his work cataloging artifacts, but each time he touched a piece from the excavation site, he felt a subtle vibration as if the object remembered its owner. The story of that burial chamber spread quietly among colleagues who specialized in long-forgotten civilizations. Some warned him to leave the objects untouched, while others encouraged documentation, because the academic prestige outweighed any personal discomfort. He hesitated because he had never believed in curses or restless spirits, yet the sensation was impossible to ignore. Night after night, he found himself waking at odd hours and staring at the corners of his apartment, convinced he could see a figure standing silently just beyond the light of his lamp. Meanwhile, across the world, other archaeologists uncovered similarly unnerving burials. In a remote region of Mongolia, burial mounds revealed skeletons arranged in patterns that suggested ceremonial purpose, but also something more disturbing. The bodies were positioned as though they were still performing daily tasks, and some of the smaller skeletons appeared to have been carefully placed to watch over the larger ones. Explorers who first entered these tombs reported a sudden coldness and a feeling that they were intruding on a private moment long sealed by earth and time. Some swore they heard faint footsteps echoing beneath the mounds even though the tunnels were empty. In the humid jungles of Southeast Asia, explorers found an elaborate network of underground tombs where corpses had been preserved by unusual mixtures of soil and resin. These tombs were often decorated with small statues and intricate carvings, depicting mythological creatures designed to guard the dead. The locals spoke of spirits called to life by improper burials who would wander until appeased. Early researchers laughed at these tales until they found evidence of structural collapse caused not by natural decay but seemingly by something that had shifted from within the walls. They left quickly with a quiet agreement to never speak of what they had seen. Back with the young archaeologist in his dimly lit apartment, he began noticing changes in his own behavior. Objects moved slightly when he was not looking. Small scratches appeared on walls that he could not explain. He attempted to rationalize each event as mundane coincidences, yet the unease persisted. One night he dreamt of the burial chamber in vivid detail. The figure at the edge of his vision beckoned him silently. He woke with his heart pounding and the artifact from the tomb resting on the floor beside his bed. The Viking ship burials had a quieter sort of eeriness. When the ships were discovered centuries later, the remains of the crew were so well preserved that the explorers described a sense of ceremony frozen in time. No one disturbed the remains without feeling an uncanny presence. Scholars debated whether this was psychological or if there was truly a lingering force tied to the ritual itself. The fires that once lit the path to Valhalla now served as a metaphorical warning for those who dared to enter. Some visitors claimed that even after leaving the site they could hear faint creaking of wood as though the ships had resumed their journey into the fog of the past. In Egypt, the mummies themselves were often less frightening than the traps set to protect them. Tombs filled with curses were designed to ward off looters, and the warnings inscribed on walls were chilling in their specificity. Scholars who dismissed these threats as superstition found themselves facing misfortune inexplicably. A historian cataloging hieroglyphics reported illness and accidents in the days following the tomb visit. While scientific reasoning could account for disease or environmental hazards, the alignment of misfortune with the opening of tombs could not be easily ignored. Meanwhile, back in South America, some cultures placed their dead in deep caverns sealed with heavy stones. The bodies were surrounded by textiles that had been dyed and painted with symbolic patterns. Explorers who disturbed these burials reported sudden anxiety and dreams that seemed to replay the moment of discovery in endless loops. Some described feeling watched, and a heaviness in the air that made breathing laborious. The notion that the dead might be conscious of intrusion is not new, but these accounts suggested a subtle yet persistent force lingering within these sacred spaces. The archaeologist in his apartment could no longer ignore the signs. Footsteps at night became louder and shadows more defined. He noticed that photographs he had taken at the excavation site contained faint silhouettes that were not visible at the time of exposure. He began to sleep in the living room with lights on, hoping the presence would leave him alone. Instead, he awoke to the sound of a low hum vibrating through the floorboards, and the artifact now resting at the center of his small table. The room felt alive in a way that was both unsettling and hypnotic. The bog bodies of northern Europe had a stillness that betrayed their violent deaths. The bodies looked alive, and the meticulous positioning suggested deliberate intent. Archaeologists noted facial expressions that could almost be read as warnings or pleas. The methodical placement of hands and limbs created an effect that lingered in the minds of those who studied them. Visitors to these bogs sometimes described a shiver that began at the base of the spine and radiated outward as if the bodies themselves were aware of their scrutiny. Even in Africa, the chambers beneath the ground contained artifacts that seemed to resist removal. Explorers described a sensation of oppressive weight when lifting certain objects, and a subtle vibration as though the items remembered the hands that once tended them. The care in which the dead had been laid to rest suggested reverence but also a warning. Those who ignored it often found themselves plagued with a series of minor misfortunes that escalated over time. In some cases, unexplained deaths were reported, leading locals to reinforce their cautionary tales. The young archaeologist now faced a terrifying choice. He could continue his studies and risk further encounters with the presence, or he could attempt to return the artifact to the burial chamber, hoping it would restore equilibrium. As he stared at the small object glowing faintly in the light, he felt the air thicken around him, and a faint whisper brush against his ear. It was a single word spoken so softly that he almost missed it. He turned toward the sound and froze. The whispered word lingered in the archaeologist's ears, as if echoing from deep within the walls themselves. He could not decipher it clearly, but there was an urgency in its tone that made his skin prickle. Every instinct told him to step away, to retreat to safety, yet he felt a strange pull toward the artifact. It seemed to hum faintly in response to his gaze, and the shadows in the corners of his apartment stretched as if leaning closer. He reached for it slowly, his fingers trembling as though the object resisted his touch, and when his skin met the smooth surface, he felt a chill radiate through his body that left him momentarily paralyzed. Across the globe, other explorers were experiencing similar sensations in different ways. In Mongolia, the ceremonial skeletons seemed to shift slightly when nobody was looking. Researchers noted footprints in dust and faint impressions in the soil that could not be accounted for by wind or wildlife. Small statues that decorated the tombs were found lying in new positions, and tools once left untouched had been rearranged. Some attributed it to seismic activity or settling soil, but the repeated incidents created an unsettling pattern that suggested something more deliberate. In Southeast Asia, the underground tombs continued to confound those who studied them. Resin and soil had preserved bodies in near-perfect condition, and the tunnels were decorated with protective carvings. Scholars visiting the site reported hearing footsteps and whispers that seemed to echo off the walls yet had no source. Some claimed to see movement in the shadows, while others simply felt the temperature drop sharply, as though a living presence had entered the chamber. Locals warned that disturbing the tombs could awaken spirits tasked with guarding the dead, and the repeated reports of eerie experiences reinforced these warnings. The archaeologist sat in his dimly lit apartment contemplating what he had done. He had cataloged artifacts for decades, and never experienced anything resembling this presence. Yet here he was unable to sleep and increasingly convinced that the object in front of him was connected to the whispers and shadows. Every time he looked away it seemed to vibrate lightly, and he could not shake the feeling that unseen eyes were tracking his every movement. He tried rational explanations and scientific reasoning, yet none accounted for the strange sensations that had taken residence in his home. In Egypt, tombs continued to exert an influence over those who studied them. Mummies with missing limbs or damaged wrappings seemed to carry an aura of discomfort that unsettled visitors. Scholars examining hieroglyphics often reported small accidents or feelings of nausea. The curses inscribed on walls were generally dismissed as superstition, yet the alignment of misfortune with disturbed tombs could not be entirely ignored. It seemed as though the meticulous rituals of the past had left a residual effect on the physical world long after the original participants were gone. Meanwhile, South American caves continued to house carefully positioned bodies surrounded by ceremonial textiles. Explorers who ventured into these spaces often felt a sudden oppressive weight and disorientation. The closer they approached the most intact bodies, the more intense the sensation became. Some described it as a quiet insistence that they leave the tomb intact, while others felt a strange sense of communication with the departed. Dreams began to mirror the tombs themselves, showing intricate tunnels and dark spaces filled with silent figures. Many returned from the sites exhausted and emotionally drained, unable to explain why they felt compelled to keep visiting despite the discomfort. In Northern Europe, the bog bodies remained unervingly lifelike. Facial expressions preserved by peat and natural chemicals suggested emotion and awareness. Visitors noted that no matter how they approached or observed the bodies, it felt as though they were being watched. The sensation was subtle at first, a flicker in peripheral vision or a slight shiver along the spine, but it grew stronger over time. Scholars and enthusiasts alike reported sleepless nights and dreams, filled with silent figures whose eyes followed them even when awake. Some began to believe that the preservation methods themselves had created a bridge between the living and the dead. African burial chambers with artifacts and sacred objects continued to enforce their quiet warnings. Items carefully arranged to guide the dead into the next world seemed to respond to the presence of intruders. Explorers described a heaviness in the air and a sensation of being observed. When items were moved without care, subtle misfortunes followed. A sudden illness or small accident reminded them that these were not ordinary burials but carefully controlled spaces that demanded respect. The stories passed quietly among archaeologists, reinforcing the notion that human curiosity had limits even in the modern age. The young archaeologist made a decision he did not want to make. He would attempt to return the artifact to the burial site in hopes of restoring balance. He prepared the journey, meticulously packing only essential supplies and ensuring that no one else would accompany him. As he traveled, he felt the presence grow stronger, as if aware of his intentions. Shadows seemed to stretch across the ground in unnatural ways, and whispers occasionally drifted through the trees. The sensation was not threatening, but insistent, urging him to proceed carefully and acknowledge the past rather than impose his will upon it. Upon reaching the excavation site, he carefully opened the sealed chamber and placed the artifact in its original position. For a moment, nothing happened. The air was still and heavy, and he felt as though he had disturbed a quiet peace. Then a faint warmth spread through the chamber, and the whispering ceased. He took a step back, and for the first time in weeks felt the weight lift from his shoulders. Yet as he turned to leave, he noticed a figure in the far corner of the tomb. It was faint and almost transparent, but it was undeniably there. Its eyes seemed to fix upon him, and it did not move or speak. He froze, unsure whether to retreat or acknowledge the presence. The artifact had been returned, but the figure remained as if guarding something beyond his understanding. He felt the air thicken once more, and the faint hum of the object vibrated in harmony with the silence of the tomb. He realized that returning the artifact had not ended the connection, but had perhaps awakened a new awareness. The figure remained still, but there was an undeniable sense that the archaeologist was no longer alone. Something had shifted in the delicate balance between past and present. The whisper that had haunted him now seemed to take form in shadow and air. Its presence was quiet but commanding, and he understood that whatever rested in this tomb had expectations beyond mere observation. It was as though centuries of ritual had created a consciousness that would not tolerate casual interference. He stepped slowly backward, every sense heightened and every instinct alert. Then he heard a second whisper, faint but clearer than before. It was a single word that froze him in place and made him question whether the tomb was merely a resting place or something far more alive than anyone had dared imagine. The second whisper lingered in the archaeologist's mind like a thread pulling him deeper into the tomb. He could not decipher the word, but it carried a weight that made his knees weak and his heart pulse in slow, heavy beats. The shadow in the corner remained still yet undeniable, as if it were observing not just him but every movement and thought. He realized that this presence was patient, ancient, and intricately connected to the burial rituals that had preserved both body and story for centuries. It was not hostile, but it demanded acknowledgement. As he studied the figure, he noticed subtle details that had been invisible at first glance. The form seemed to shift with the light flickering across the walls, and its edges were not fixed but fluid. He could sense an intelligence behind the silence, and a memory encoded in every curve and shadow. The artifact on the stone pedestal continued to hum faintly, and its vibrations seemed to echo the rhythm of the figure's presence. He wondered if it was a guardian or perhaps a remnant of the person originally buried. Far away in Mongolia, researchers continued to experience subtle but undeniable phenomena in the ceremonial mounds. Skeletons previously catalogued as static now appeared slightly repositioned. Tools had shifted from where they were left. Tiny scratches on wooden carvings suggested interaction with the objects that could not be explained by natural causes. The scientists speculated that the rituals performed centuries ago had left a residual consciousness behind, and that the very act of observing these preserved figures was enough to awaken traces of awareness. In Southeast Asia, the underground tombs seemed to respond to the attention of the archaeologists. Air currents shifted even when the chambers were sealed. Shadows stretched along the walls in unnatural angles. Small objects moved from their original placement, as though signaling the visitors to observe, but not touch. Researchers reported feeling a subtle insistence that they acknowledge the respect owed to those interred. Some believed it was the spirits themselves communicating in silence, while others thought the intricate carvings and preservation methods had created an enduring psychological effect. The archaeologist in Egypt had long since learned to respect the curses inscribed on tomb walls, yet he could not avoid curiosity. Mummies displayed unusual deformities and missing body parts, but there was still a presence of meticulous care. He realized that the precision of preservation was intended not merely for the dead but to assert a continuing authority over the living who dared to enter. Those who ignored these ancient warnings often experienced accidents that were minor but consistent. It was a subtle reminder that history had a long memory and that the dead had a way of influencing the present without ever speaking aloud. In South America, explorers found themselves in tight caves with skeletons surrounded by ceremonial textiles. The air was dense, and each step seemed to disturb not just dust but something more intangible. As the explorers documented their findings, they reported feeling a quiet insistence to respect the order of the burial. Dreams followed them home, replicating the tunnels and chambers they had entered. Sleep became uneasy. Shadows appeared in corners of their rooms. Some woke to faint hums that seemed to correspond to the positioning of the bodies they had studied. The bog bodies in northern Europe continued to fascinate and unsettle. Their faces, preserved in near-perfect detail, conveyed expressions that could almost be read as emotion. Hands were positioned deliberately, limbs arranged with care. Scholars described a sense of being watched that began subtly and intensified over time. Observers noted their own posture changing unconsciously. They hesitated to turn away. Eyes followed them across the room in photographs and sketches. The preserved bodies seemed to demand attention and quiet contemplation. In Africa, the subterranean chambers continued to exert influence over explorers. Sacred objects that were carefully arranged and preserved seemed to resist removal. Explorers described subtle vibrations and changes in temperature when handling these items. Minor misfortunes followed any careless interference. Some were small accidents, while others were more mysterious illnesses. The cumulative effect reinforced the notion that the dead maintained control over their spaces long after burial, and that human curiosity could not be allowed to dominate these rituals without consequence. The archaeologist faced the shadow directly for the first time. He stepped forward, slowly, aware that every movement was being measured and observed. He realized that his presence and the return of the artifact had awakened something that was not entirely corporeal, but not entirely intangible either. The tomb seemed to breathe around him. The hum from the artifact grew slightly louder in response to the shadow. The walls seemed to vibrate with an energy that was ancient and deliberate. He understood that the whisper had been a summons. Something expected him to act not recklessly but with understanding. A faint glow appeared around the shadow, and he felt an awareness settle into the room. It was neither threatening nor comforting, but deeply deliberate. He sensed the centuries of care in every preserved object in the tomb and realized that returning the artifact had begun a dialogue that had no words. The shadow's form seemed to acknowledge his respect. The hum of the object synchronized with the subtle rhythm of his heartbeat. Time in the tomb became fluid. He felt as though he was both observer and participant in a ritual far older than he could comprehend. Then he noticed movement in the artifact itself. The hum shifted into a rhythm that suggested communication. Patterns of vibration seemed to correspond with subtle flickers of light around the shadow. He reached out tentatively, and his fingertips brushed the surface. The vibration intensified, and the shadow's form solidified slightly. It was clear that the artifact was not simply an object, but a conduit. A message was being conveyed across centuries through preservation, ritual, and the careful orchestration of death itself. The figure stepped slightly closer, though still remained partially indistinct. The whisper returned a final time. The sound carried meaning now not as a single word, but as an insistence. Respect the past. Acknowledge the dead. Do not interfere. The archaeologist understood that his role was now a balance of observation and reverence. One misstep could awaken forces that had been long dormant. The shadow remained silent, but its presence was undeniably active. He knew that leaving the tomb immediately was not an option. He had been chosen as a temporary custodian of this space and its artifacts. As he prepared to leave the inner chamber, a faint movement in the walls drew his attention. There was a small alcove he had not noticed before. Inside, barely visible in dim light, was another object wrapped in cloth. Its texture and placement suggested that it was meant to remain untouched. The shadow seemed to acknowledge it with a subtle nod of shape and hue. He realized that the tomb contained layers of responsibility and messages embedded within centuries of preservation. Any interaction carried consequence. He stepped closer, cautiously aware that the next decision could redefine his understanding of life and death itself. The small alcove drew him in with a quiet insistence that was impossible to ignore. He approached, slowly aware that every step echoed softly across the stone floor, and that the air itself seemed to hold its breath. Inside the alcove lay a bundle wrapped in faded cloth that had been untouched for centuries. The hum of the artifact on the pedestal seemed to resonate with the object in the alcove, as if the two were connected across space and time. He felt the shadow shift slightly closer, observing his every movement, yet remaining silent and inscrutable. As he reached out to touch the bundle, a sudden chill ran down his spine. The air thickened as though the tomb itself had recognized his intent. He hesitated, considering whether interference might trigger consequences beyond his comprehension. The whisper returned one last time, carrying no words, but a tone that implied caution and guidance. Respect the past. Do not rush. Observe carefully. The archaeologist understood that he was being tested not in strength or intellect, but in patience and reverence. He lifted the bundle slowly and felt a faint vibration beneath the cloth. Opening it revealed a small set of objects that seemed ceremonial in nature. Each piece was meticulously preserved and displayed symbols of life, death, and continuity. The craftsmanship suggested that the items were not merely offerings, but components of a ritual designed to guide the spirit of the deceased. The shadow shifted its form slightly closer, as if approving the discovery, yet simultaneously warning that these items were not to be disturbed lightly. The archaeologist examined the objects one by one. A small carved figurine appeared to depict a guardian spirit. A delicate tablet bore inscriptions that were not language, but symbolic patterns. Tiny vessels contained residues that had hardened over time, but still exuded a faint energy he could not explain. He realized that each item had been placed with purpose, and that the collective arrangement created a network of intention that had endured across centuries. Disturbing even one element could disrupt the delicate balance. Meanwhile, other tombs across the world continued to reveal subtle signs of lingering presence. In Mongolia, the ceremonial skeletons seemed to communicate through minor shifts and movements. In Southeast Asia, objects in the underground tombs rearranged themselves imperceptibly. In South America, the deep caves projected a quiet insistence through air pressure and sound. It was as if ancient human intent had left a permanent imprint on the material world. Scholars speculated about residual energy and consciousness, but the consistency of reports suggested a phenomenon more than superstition. Back in Europe, the bog bodies maintained an unsettling awareness. The faces remained so lifelike that observers often felt guilt or unease, as though the bodies could see them judging their intentions. The meticulous positioning of hands and limbs reinforced the sense that even death demanded compliance with order. Observers left photographs and notes, but the sensations persisted long after they exited the bogs. There was a quiet insistence that the dead were watching, and that the living must respect the boundaries imposed by preservation and ritual. In Africa, the subterranean burial chambers continued to exert influence over those who entered. Sacred objects seemed to vibrate subtly when touched. Explorers reported minor ailments after interfering with the careful arrangement of artifacts. The chambers themselves felt alive with intention. Respecting the placement of objects and observing the rituals in silence appeared to minimize consequences. Human arrogance and impatience frequently triggered discomfort or misfortune. The archaeologist had begun to understand that he had been chosen to navigate this fine line. He returned the small ceremonial bundle to its original alcove placement after careful study. The shadow seemed to acknowledge this act of reverence with subtle movement. The hum of the original artifact synchronized with the bundle as though approving its position. A faint warmth filled the tomb. The whisper faded, leaving only a low vibration in the air. He stepped back and realized that the tomb was not merely a repository of bones and objects, but a living archive of intention, memory, and ritual. Each element had been curated for preservation and for influence on the observer. The artifact on the pedestal continued to hum faintly. The shadow now appeared closer to the object, suggesting a bond between the figure and the ceremonial items. He understood that the shadow was not malevolent. It was guardian and guide. It existed to maintain the sanctity of the burial and ensure that the lessons encoded in ritual endured. The archaeologist felt a sense of awe mingled with fear. He had entered this tomb as an observer, but now he was part of a chain of care and respect that stretched across centuries. He spent hours in quiet contemplation studying the arrangement of objects. Every item told a story. Every detail conveyed intention. He realized that he had been given a unique opportunity to witness a dialogue between the living and the dead. The shadow remained present, silently watching his study but not interfering. The air was heavy but not threatening. Time seemed to flow differently in the tomb. He understood that leaving too soon would mean severing the connection prematurely, while lingering too long could risk overstaying and provoking unknown consequences. Finally, he prepared to leave the inner chamber. The shadow moved slightly to indicate a path. The archaeologist followed, slowly, aware that every step was observed and measured. The hum of the artifact remained with him as he exited. Outside the tomb, the air felt lighter, yet he carried the weight of knowledge. He understood that he had witnessed not merely burial rituals, but a system of preservation that enforced respect, memory, and continuity. The whispers had ceased, but the presence lingered as if ready to return whenever the sacred order was disturbed. As he stepped back into daylight, he noticed a faint shimmer in the air near the tomb entrance. It was subtle but unmistakable. A form of shadow moved briefly, and then settled into the space between light and earth. He realized that the tomb and its guardian would continue to watch over the past, but now his role had been acknowledged. He felt a quiet sense of completion, yet a lingering awareness that this was only one chapter of countless interactions that the dead and the living would continue to share. Just as he turned to leave, he felt the artifact in his pack hum lightly. It was impossible to tell whether it was responding to him or to some distant memory embedded in the tomb. He paused. The hum grew slightly louder. In the corner of his vision, a faint flicker suggested movement, though there was nothing there. He sensed that a new layer of mystery had emerged. Something within the tomb had awakened more fully, and the boundaries of the living and dead were subtly shifting once again. The artifact hummed persistently as he walked away from the tomb. He carried it carefully in his pack, aware that every vibration might be a signal. Shadows seemed to linger at the edge of his vision, though the sunlight streamed down on the earth and made the world appear normal. Yet he could not shake the feeling that the tomb had extended itself beyond its walls and that the guardian shadow had left a subtle imprint on his perception. It was as if the presence had followed him into daylight to ensure he honored the interaction correctly. The journey back to his temporary residence was quiet. He noticed small details that had escaped him before. A bird perched unusually still on a branch. The wind seemed to carry a faint echo of distant whispers. The artifact vibrated in response as though attuned to the world in ways he could not comprehend. He understood that he was now connected not only to the tomb, but to a network of presence that spanned the globe, wherever human ritual had sought to preserve the dead with reverence and intent. In Mongolia, researchers continued to document the ceremonial mounds. They recorded minute shifts in skeletons and artifacts that occurred when no living hand had intervened. The patterns of movement suggested interaction with observers, as if the dead were aware of scrutiny and had a method of responding subtly. Photographs revealed impressions and faint shadows that were absent when the site was first catalogued. Scholars speculated that the ancient rituals had left a consciousness embedded in the material itself. The idea was unsettling yet undeniable. Meanwhile, in Southeast Asia, the underground tombs exhibited similar anomalies. Objects appeared to realign after visitors left. Air currents shifted in ways that could not be explained by natural ventilation. Shadows lengthened and shortened, even when the sun or torchlight could not account for the changes. Those who entered the chambers reported feeling gently guided by unseen forces, as though the spirits of the dead had a protocol for interacting with the living. Intrusions were subtly corrected, and those who disregarded the instructions reported minor accidents or misfortune. In South America, deep cave burials produced reports of subtle vibrations in the air. The textiles and ceremonial items seemed to emit faint pulses that corresponded to the movement of explorers. Dreams mirrored the tunnels and chambers with uncanny precision. Observers reported feeling watched without fear but with a solemn awareness that the spaces were alive with purpose. The preservation of bodies and objects appeared less about display and more about communication across the divide between life and death. The bog bodies of northern Europe maintained their unnerving expressions. Observers described the sensation of being watched even outside the bogs. Photographs captured subtle changes in positioning and facial expression that were impossible to explain. Those who lingered felt compelled to leave offerings or gestures of respect before departing. The bodies themselves became conduits for historical presence and cautionary observation. They were reminders that meticulous preservation carried a responsibility for the living. African subterranean burial chambers continued to convey subtle warnings. Sacred objects vibrated when disturbed. Minor accidents followed careless handling. The chambers themselves maintained a low hum perceptible only to those attuned to the ritual and history embedded in the space. The careful arrangement of bodies and artifacts demonstrated an enduring system of respect and communication. Those who ignored it often faced a series of small but persistent inconveniences until they restored order and reverence. The archaeologist settled into a routine with the artifact. He catalogued findings, carefully consulted his notes, and reread the inscriptions in the tomb. The hum of the object persisted faintly, as if reminding him of the presence that had guided him. At night he noticed shadows in his apartment stretching unnaturally and subtle vibrations in the floor. He resisted the urge to panic. The artifact and shadow had conveyed a message of guidance and respect. His role had become one of custodian, observer, and participant in an ongoing ritual whose rules he only partially understood. One evening, as he studied the artifact, he noticed a faint glow in its surface. The vibrations changed subtly, and the shadows in the room seemed to lean closer without movement. He realized that the artifact had a memory of the tomb encoded within it. The hum pulsed in patterns that suggested thought or intentionality. The shadow in the tomb had left a mark upon the object, and that mark had transferred to him. He was now part of a chain of guardianship that spanned centuries and continents. He pondered the implications. The artifact was not merely an object, but a bridge between worlds. The shadow had imparted responsibility without instruction. The patterns he noticed in the hum and vibration were deliberate, but subtle. There was no hostility, only expectation. He understood that the deceased had created systems to communicate and enforce respect across time. The artifact was alive with that intention, and he had been chosen to receive it temporarily. Late that night, a whisper returned. It was faint, almost imperceptible, yet insistent. The tone suggested patience and observation rather than alarm. He followed it, mentally tracing the pattern of vibration and glow across the artifact. The connection deepened, as though the artifact and shadow were teaching him the rhythm of interaction. The whispers carried no words but conveyed the framework of respect that had governed centuries of ritual and preservation. He realized that understanding would require time, patience, and unwavering attention. As he drifted toward a restless sleep, the hum shifted one final time for the night. It carried a sense of continuity and watchfulness. The shadow in the tomb remained present in his mind even across the distance. The artifact had become an anchor, not just for him, but for the memory of ritual and care embedded in the tomb. He understood that life and death were connected through action, respect, and observation, and that the simplest misstep could disrupt balance. A new layer of responsibility had settled on his shoulders, yet there was also a sense of awe. Just before sleep overtook him, he saw a flicker at the corner of his vision. The faintest form of the shadow appeared almost translucent, yet unmistakably there. Its movement was deliberate, slow, and impossible to ignore. The artifact pulsed in rhythm with the flicker, and he realized that despite distance, he had not left the tomb entirely behind. Something deeper had awakened, and the connection between the artifact's shadow and tomb was far from complete. The flicker lingered in the corner of his vision like a heartbeat suspended in space. He remained still, knowing that any sudden movement might disrupt the fragile connection. The artifact in his pack pulsed softly, vibrating with a rhythm that seemed to synchronize with his own breathing. Shadows stretched across the room, forming subtle shapes that almost suggested eyes watching from beyond the walls. He understood now that the tomb, the shadow, and the artifact had formed a network of attention and awareness that extended far beyond the original burial chamber. Across the globe, similar phenomena persisted. In Mongolia, the ceremonial mounds displayed faint traces of movement when observers entered. Bones were slightly shifted, tools subtly repositioned, as though the dead were reminding the living of boundaries and protocols. The researchers could feel the presence even when the tombs were sealed, a weight pressing gently but unmistakably on their consciousness. They moved carefully, documenting without disturbing, as if their very awareness was part of the ritual. In Southeast Asia, the underground tombs seemed to hum in response to the archaeologist's artifact. Though thousands of miles away, subtle vibrations and faint light flickers in the chambers suggested a kind of resonance. Shadows moved with deliberate slowness, echoing gestures of care performed centuries before. Explorers reported unease and awe, feeling that the rituals preserved a consciousness that monitored behavior across both time and space. They walked lightly, whispering apologies to the dead, though no voice responded. South American cave burials continued to exert influence on those who approached. Textiles and ceremonial items seemed to pulse faintly as if connected by invisible threads to observers. Dreams of the tunnels mirrored waking interactions with unnerving accuracy. Explorers described waking to faint vibrations and shadows aligned precisely with the position of objects inside the caves. The dead were not silent. They communicated in patterns and subtleties. Observation required patience, reverence, and care, or misfortune would quietly follow. The bog bodies in northern Europe maintained a presence that lingered long after observers left the site. Facial expressions remained disturbingly lifelike. Limbs positioned with deliberate care conveyed silent messages. Those who lingered reported dreams of being watched, a sensation that their own movements were being recorded in the silent archives of the bog. Photographs sometimes captured slight shifts in expression or posture. Observers became part of the ritual, their awareness folded into centuries of careful preservation. African subterranean burial chambers reinforced lessons about reverence. Sacred objects vibrated imperceptibly when handled. Subtle misfortunes followed careless movement. The chambers felt alive with intention. The arrangement of bodies and artifacts encoded centuries of observance. Explorers who ignored the ritual framework were reminded through minor misfortune that respect was compulsory. The archaeologist understood that this pattern extended globally, that human action and awareness were woven into an enduring system maintained by both objects and spirits. He returned to his apartment, carrying the artifact with a new awareness. It was no longer merely an object. It was a conduit, a pulse of presence, a subtle record of ritual memory. Shadows shifted in response to its hum. Light flickered as though communicating. He realized he had become a participant in a century-spanning dialogue between life and death. The artifact pulsed in a rhythm he could not fully interpret, yet he felt it aligning with distant burials, linking him to other spaces where the dead watched and guided. Late at night, the artifact pulsed stronger. Shadows in his apartment became more distinct, forming shapes that seemed deliberate but inscrutable. The flicker returned in the corner of his eye, now sharper, as though testing him. He understood that he was not merely a passive observer. The object and shadow required engagement. Respect had been observed, but the ritual demanded attention. He could not ignore the presence or treat it as a relic. It was alive with expectation. He spent hours observing the artifact, noting the rhythm of vibrations and subtle shifts in light. Each pulse suggested a pattern, a communication method that was slow, deliberate, and patient. He understood that the centuries of ritual had encoded intention into every fiber of the artifact, every shadowed corner of the tomb, and every preserved body he had encountered. The whispers had faded, but their echoes remained in the vibrations, in the flickers, in the silent insistence of observation and reverence. Then he noticed something new. A second pulse, subtler, emanating not from the artifact but from the shadows themselves. They moved with deliberate care, responding to his awareness, guiding his attention to corners of the room he had not focused on before. A pattern began to emerge, like a slow unfolding map of interactions spanning both space and memory. He realized that the shadow and artifact were not merely communicative but interactive. They expected him to participate in a system that had outlasted centuries and continents. He studied the second pulse closely. Each vibration of the artifact aligned with subtle movement in the shadows. He began tracing them mentally, observing the flow, noting the rhythm. It was a slow dialogue, a negotiation of presence and respect. He understood that the dead had created a protocol not just for burial but for ongoing interaction with the living. It was delicate, precise, and required patience. Any disruption could have consequences beyond his comprehension. Hours passed. The artifact pulsed steadily. Shadows shifted with purpose. He understood the nature of his new role. He was now a custodian and participant. Observation was action. Reverence was interaction. The whispers and flickers were not merely warnings. They were guidance. The ritual had extended beyond the tomb, beyond the artifact, beyond time itself. He could feel a network of awareness connecting him to distant tombs, caves, and mounds. It was as if centuries of preservation and ceremony had created a living archive, and he was part of its unfolding story. Just as he leaned back to rest, the artifact pulsed in an unexpected rhythm. It was rapid and insistent. Shadows twisted, elongating toward him. A low hum, previously imperceptible, grew louder in tandem with the artifact. He froze. Something new had awakened, something that had remained dormant until now. The boundaries between tomb, artifact, shadow, and observer were shifting. A presence that had been subtle was asserting itself more strongly than ever before. The rapid pulse of the artifact reverberated through the room and through the archaeologist's own body. He felt each vibration like a faint pulse of life that had nothing to do with his own heartbeat. The shadows elongated and shifted with deliberate slowness. They moved across walls and floors in patterns he could not predict. The artifact's hum synchronized with the movement, as though orchestrating the shadows like instruments in a slow symphony of presence. He understood that the tomb, the artifact, and the shadow were not merely remnants of history. They were active participants in a dialogue that required patience and precise attention. Outside his apartment, the world seemed unchanged, but he noticed subtle echoes of the tomb's presence. A breeze carried faint whispers that seemed intelligible in fragments. Light flickered unnaturally through the trees and along streets. Objects in his apartment shifted imperceptibly. He understood that the connection between artifact and shadow had not ended with the tomb. It had expanded, reaching beyond the boundaries of physical space. The dead were no longer confined to their burial sites. They were aware, attentive, and subtly guiding his awareness. In Mongolia, the ceremonial skeletons exhibited new patterns of movement. Small items previously assumed fixed now repositioned themselves with regularity. The observers documented these shifts with a mixture of apprehension and fascination. They began to realize that the presence embedded in the preserved bodies was responsive, capable of interacting with the living in subtle, deliberate ways. The notion of consciousness persisting beyond death became harder to dismiss. Observation was no longer passive. It was a form of participation. Southeast Asian tombs mirrored these effects. Air currents shifted even in sealed chambers. Shadows moved without source. Objects realigned with precise subtlety. Visitors reported feelings of being guided toward careful observation, almost as though the spirits were imparting instructions. The archaeologist sensed a connection between these global phenomena and his artifact. The pulses and vibrations were part of a language that spanned continents and centuries. The dead were communicating through presence, pattern, and timing. He understood that his role was to interpret, respect, and maintain the delicate balance. South American caves maintained their own rhythm. The textiles and ceremonial objects pulsed faintly when touched or approached. Dreams reflected the tunnels and chambers in uncanny detail. Observers reported feeling drawn into the patterns, compelled to follow subtle cues. Missteps were met with minor misfortunes, accidental disturbances, or disorienting sensations. The network of awareness among the dead and their preserved environments was real, active, and persistent. He realized that he was now connected to it in ways that were profound and irreversible. Northern European bog bodies continued to exert silent influence. Their preserved faces conveyed awareness and judgment. Limbs positioned with care communicated subtle instruction. Visitors found themselves altering posture, movement, and approach instinctively. Observers left behind a part of themselves in the silent archive of the bog. The archaeologist recognized parallels with the artifact's influence on him. Each pulse, each vibration was part of a continuum, a slow dialogue requiring patience and careful attention. African subterranean burial chambers reinforced the same principle. Sacred objects emitted faint vibrations when moved. Minor accidents followed those who handled items without care. The chambers were alive with intention. The arrangement of bodies and artifacts encoded instructions across time. Observers were expected to participate with awareness. Ignorance or carelessness prompted subtle consequences. The archaeologist understood that these effects were mirrored in the artifact as insistent pulse and the shadow as twisting form. He was now part of a global network of guardianship. The artifact in his apartment vibrated with increasing intensity. Shadows responded with elongated gestures across walls and floors. The archaeologist could feel the connection expanding, linking his awareness with distant tombs and rituals. Patterns emerged. Pulses aligned with subtle shifts in light and shadow. The artifact's hum became a language of rhythm, a dialogue that conveyed expectation without words. The shadow's form grew more distinct, deliberate, and responsive. He understood that the presence had shifted from passive observation to active engagement. He spent hours following the pulses. Each movement of the shadow synchronized with vibrations. Each flicker of light aligned with a rhythm he could feel but not yet fully interpret. He realized that centuries of careful ritual and preservation had encoded a protocol for engagement that transcended both time and distance. Observation, reverence, patience, and precise attention were the rules. Any disruption could awaken consequences he could not predict. The artifact had become both teacher and conduit. Late in the night, a new pattern emerged. The artifact pulsed rapidly in irregular sequences. The shadow moved in complex arcs across the floor, walls, and ceiling. A faint whisper reached his ears. It carried no words but conveyed urgency. He understood that the tomb and artifact were not finished with him. Something dormant had awakened. The global network of awareness among the dead and their preserved objects was now asserting itself more strongly than ever. The pulse of presence demanded acknowledgement, focus, and careful response. He stepped back, heart pounding, aware that the shadow was guiding him toward the corners of the room he had not yet considered. The artifact's hum intensified as if emphasizing the importance of observation. Light flickered across the surface, revealing subtle shapes previously unnoticed. The presence was deliberate. The connection was expanding. The dialogue between living and dead was evolving. He realized that he could no longer remain a passive observer. The network of awareness was awakening in response to his attention. Just as he leaned closer to study the flickering shadows, a faint glow appeared from beneath the artifact. The light spread slowly across the floor like liquid, reflecting patterns that mirrored symbols he had seen in the tomb. The shadow elongated further, twisting and bending around the glow. The vibrations in the artifact increased, resonating with the rhythm of the shadows. He froze, understanding that a new phase of interaction had begun. The dead, the artifact, and the shadow were no longer passive observers. They had awakened fully and were demanding active participation. The glow spread across the floor like liquid light and reflected strange geometric patterns he had only glimpsed in the tomb. Shadows elongated, twisting with deliberate precision as if dancing to the vibration of the artifact. He stood frozen, realizing that the presence was no longer subtle. It had shifted from passive observation to active orchestration. Every pulse, every flicker, every subtle vibration carried meaning. He understood that the artifact, the shadow, and the tomb were now interacting with him in real time. The hum of the artifact intensified. It seemed to resonate not only with the shadow but with distant tombs and preserved sites around the world. In Mongolia, the ceremonial skeletons shifted subtly in response to vibrations he could not perceive directly. In Southeast Asia, objects in underground tombs realigned themselves following a rhythm that mirrored the artifact's pulsing. In South America, ceremonial textiles and objects vibrated faintly, as if participating in a silent global ritual. The network of presence among the dead had awakened fully. He stepped closer to the artifact, noticing that the glow formed a pattern resembling the inscriptions in the tomb. He realized that the artifact was not merely transmitting energy but translating centuries of ritual intention into a form he could perceive. Each pulse was a signal, each vibration a message, each shadow a guide. The presence demanded not just observation but participation. The artifact had become a bridge between him and the accumulated awareness of those buried and preserved across continents. In northern Europe, the bog bodies seemed to respond with subtle movements. Limbs and faces shifted imperceptibly, conveying acknowledgement or guidance. Visitors reported feelings of being watched and guided by invisible forces. Minor misfortunes following those who disregarded protocol. The preservation of the dead, he now understood, had been both protective and communicative. The dead had created systems of engagement that persisted long after the living left. He was now part of that system. African subterranean burial chambers exhibited similar resonance. Sacred objects hummed faintly in alignment with the artifact. Explorers reported subtle misalignments and realignments, minor accidents when protocol was broken. The archaeologist realized that respect and attention were encoded across cultures and time. The artifact and shadow were manifestations of that global protocol. Each pulse, flicker, and movement was a lesson in observing, honoring, and maintaining continuity between life and death. The glow of the artifact intensified further. He felt a warmth radiate through the room, subtle but undeniable. Shadows twisted into shapes that suggested forms, figures he could not identify but instinctively recognized as attentive guardians. The hum became a rhythm he could follow, a slow, deliberate cadence that synchronized with his breathing. He understood that the artifact was teaching him, slowly guiding him into a deeper understanding of the tomb's rituals and the responsibilities of observation. Hours passed as he followed the patterns. Every pulse, every flicker, every shadowed movement conveyed a message. He traced the flow of light across the floor, noticing symbols encoded in geometry and vibration. The artifact's hum changed subtly as he aligned his attention with the patterns. He realized that the dead had not left instructions in words, but in presence, vibration, and form. Observation itself was a ritual, and he was now a participant. Then the hum shifted, becoming irregular, insistent, and urgent. Shadows bent toward the artifact, forming shapes that suggested concentration and awareness. The glow spread upward, illuminating corners of the room that had previously remained dark. The patterns on the floor shifted into complex configurations resembling maps and diagrams he had glimpsed in the tomb. He understood that the interaction was reaching a climax, that the artifact, shadow, and tomb were now demanding full engagement and comprehension. He stepped closer, reaching toward the artifact. As his fingers brushed its surface, a wave of sensation passed through him. Not pain or fear, but awareness, a deep understanding of the centuries of ritual, intention, and preservation. The shadow shifted to observe him directly, twisting and folding around the artifact. Its presence was patient yet insistent. He realized that he was being initiated into the system of observation and reverence established by countless generations of the dead and preserved by meticulous care. Outside, the global network of burial sites seemed to respond in tandem. Shadows in Southeast Asia shifted, skeletal mounds in Mongolia vibrated subtly, South American textiles pulsed, bog bodies' expressions changed. The pulse of awareness extended beyond his room. He understood that the interaction he experienced was not localized, but part of a global awakening of preserved consciousness. The dead were no longer isolated in their tombs. They were connected, aware, and engaging those who had been entrusted with their observation. As the glow reached its peak, the artifact pulsed in rapid, insistent sequences. Shadows twisted and elongated, forming shapes almost humanoid, almost deliberate. The archaeologist realized he was standing at the threshold of comprehension. The dead were not simply resting. They were active participants in a continuum of care, vigilance, and attention. He was no longer merely observing. He was part of their network, a living node in the centuries-old protocol. Then, without warning, the artifact's hum ceased. The glow faded. The shadows settled into stillness. Silence filled the room like a held breath. He exhaled slowly, aware that the climax of interaction had concluded, at least temporarily. Yet he sensed a subtle presence lingering, patient and watchful. The global network of preserved consciousness remained connected. He understood that his journey had not ended. The artifact, shadow, and tomb had awakened, and his role as observer and custodian had only deepened. The silence after the artifact's pulse left the room heavy with expectation. He sat in stillness, aware that the shadows had not disappeared entirely. They lingered in the corners, subtle and patient, observing, waiting. The artifact lay on the table, dormant but humming faintly beneath the surface, a reminder that its presence was never fully gone. He understood that the interaction had reached a temporary calm. But the network of awareness, the shadow, the artifact, the tomb, and distant preserved sites remained alive, quietly attentive and fully engaged. Over the following days, he adjusted to the artifact's rhythm. Every vibration, every flicker of light, every subtle shadow became part of his daily awareness. He learned to move carefully around the object, to trace its hum with his attention, to respect the unspoken dialogue it demanded. Shadows in the room followed subtle patterns. They bent and twisted slowly, as if testing him, observing whether he maintained patience and reverence. It was not fear he felt, but humility, a deep recognition that he was now part of a centuries-old system of observation and care. He returned to his notes from the tomb, reviewing sketches and photographs. Symbols, patterns, and arrangements that had once seemed decorative now revealed layers of intention. Each artifact, each preserved body, each arrangement of bones carried deliberate meaning. The ritual had been a system of communication, encoded not in words but in presence and care. The shadow and artifact had awakened him to this truth. Observation was not passive. It was action. Participation itself was ritual. Around the world, the subtle awareness continued. In Mongolia, ceremonial mounds shifted minimally, imperceptibly, in response to observers. In Southeast Asia, objects in tombs adjusted with care when approached. In South America, textiles and ceremonial items pulsed faintly with vibrations. Northern European bog bodies conveyed quiet judgment, guiding observers to maintain reverence. African subterranean chambers whispered through vibration and minor consequence, enforcing protocol with precision. The network of preserved consciousness was active, synchronized, and far-reaching. He noticed that interaction with the artifact began to influence his perception. Shadows in his apartment moved in rhythms he could anticipate. Patterns of vibration became a form of language. He could sense the presence in distant tombs, feeling subtle pulses and alignments. Observation and attention became entwined with respect. Each action, however minor, carried consequence. Each pause, each careful gesture, reinforced the bond between living and dead. The artifact and shadow were teachers. He was their student and custodian. One evening, as he traced the rhythm of pulses, a faint flicker appeared in the corner. The shadow formed a more distinct figure, bending slowly toward the artifact. He understood that the culmination of the awakening was not dramatic or violent. It was deliberate, quiet, and patient. The network of awareness had fully engaged, acknowledging him as a participant and custodian. Respect and observation were the currency of this interaction. Any disruption could undo the balance. His role was clear, though it carried ongoing responsibility. He spent long hours in stillness, observing patterns, tracing vibrations, and documenting subtle changes. The artifact pulsed occasionally, always gentle but insistent. Shadows moved deliberately, guiding attention to details he might have otherwise overlooked. He understood that the centuries of preservation had created a living protocol. Death had not ended awareness. The careful curation of bodies, artifacts, and space maintained communication and enforced respect. Observation was action. Reverence was participation. Across continents, the network maintained its subtle orchestration. Movements of skeletons, artifacts, and textiles continued to align with distant attention. Observers were guided to honor protocol, mistakes corrected through minor accidents or subtle reconfigurations. Dreams mirrored reality. Awareness extended across space and time. The dead were active participants, attentive and precise, yet patient with those who engaged carefully. The archaeologist understood that he was now part of this continuum. Time passed, measured not by hours but by attention. The artifact pulsed at intervals, shadows twisted with deliberate intent, and the global network responded. He no longer feared the presence but embraced it. Observation became meditation, participation became ritual. Respect for the past required awareness, patience, and precise attention. The dead had created systems that endured centuries. Now he was the living node maintaining their protocol. And yet, as he prepared to set the artifact carefully aside one evening, a faint pulse, stronger than before, emanated from it. The shadows twisted into forms that suggested acknowledgement, almost like a bow. The hum resonated with the rhythm of distant tombs, mounds, and caves. He realized that this was not a conclusion but a continuation. The network of presence would endure, aware, attentive, and guiding. He was a custodian, a participant, a witness. The dead remained vigilant, not silent, not gone, and he had become part of their eternal observation. He exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of understanding settle gently across him. The artifact's hum softened. Shadows receded into corners, patient, attentive, awaiting his next act of observation. He knew that life and death were interwoven through ritual, attention, and respect. The network of awareness stretched across continents and centuries. His role would never truly end. He had glimpsed the full measure of care, preservation, and subtle communication that connected living and dead. The network remained eternal, patient, and vigilant. And in the quiet corner of his apartment, the artifact pulsed one final time that night, faint but deliberate, a reminder that the dialogue between life and death never truly ends. Journey into the forgotten rituals of civilizations long past where tombs, artifacts, and shadows whisper secrets across centuries. From Viking ship burials to mummification gone wrong, discover the eerie connections between the living and the dead. Follow an archaeologist as he uncovers a mystical artifact that links him to a global network of preserved consciousness, revealing that respect, observation, and patience can awaken forces beyond imagination. Experience suspense, mystery, and the quiet power of rituals that defy time. Subscribe to Stories Before Sleep and step into a world where history breathes, shadows move, and every story lingers long after the lights go out. Don't miss a single tale. Hit the bell and sleep with stories that haunt and mesmerize.